Welcome to your home. Does your home have an Izumo parked in it? So, where are we? Pigeon. Where should we start? So let's say like a standard, a normal battleship is shooting at you. So they have penetration angles, right? So if you look at, I'll just show you. Let's say you're shooting at another Izuma, right? You're exchanging shells with another Izuma. Keep it nice and simple. So on a site like this one, which is shiptools.st, which you can find in this list of handy sites, you can see the bounce angles. So if you look along towards the end of this row, you'll see there's a column called ricochet. And this is the standard bounce angles for guns. So the vast majority of the ships in the game have 45 to 60. But there are some that have like 60 to 67.5, like different types of improved angles. None of them have worse angles than this. This is the worst that you can get. Okay, so this is like the standard, and the vast majority of battleships, I think maybe all the battleships. Are there any battleships that have improved angles? I'm just trying to think. Duke of York. Yes, you're right. Anyway, the vast majority of battleships don't have improved angles. So if there's a battleship shooting at you, chances are it's 45 to 60. What does this mean? What it means is that if you, and this is what I explained in that that highlight that was put in chat earlier. It means there are 3 sectors. So you have a sector that's coming at an angle which is 90 degrees to the plate. So if carrots love tomatoes is the armor plate. So you have a line coming perpendicular out from the plate like that, which represents in that number scheme 0, which makes no sense to me. I think that should be 90, but never mind. We'll go with it. So this is 0. And there's a wedge that goes from there round to 45, which is that first number there. So you can read that ricochet column as actually 0 to 45, 45 to 60, and 60 to 90. Okay. MS Paint. I mean, I think I did MS Paint in that highlight. I'm just trying to do a quick version. And also, like, I think like 3D examples is pretty nice. So, because some people struggle with diagrams. So 45 is like there. So from perpendicular to the plate to 45 degrees, that's the it will never bounce angle. Okay. Then from 60 to flat, that's the always bounce angle. And in between those two, which is what this is showing, 45 to 60, that is the it might bounce wedge. So there are 3 wedges. Yeah, but the problem with that, Pigeon, I'll come back to that in a second. So there's these 3 wedges that you need to try and envisage when you're looking at a ship. Okay. Chat, please don't help right now because you'll just confuse things. I know you mean well, Airblade, but just for the minute, just right. So this angle to this angle, if you shoot, and don't forget it goes the other way as well, so it's 45 degrees that way through flat to 45 degrees the other way. So there's a 90-degree angle with normal guns where you, thank you, Yak. That's a bit extreme, but that's cool. There's a 90-degree wedge, 45 degrees either side of perpendicular to the plate, where you cannot bounce. Either your AP will go through the plate and penetrate, or it will shatter. Those are the 2 options. Okay? If you're in the very shallow angle, in this case 30-degree angle that goes from 60 to flat, that's the always bounce angle. And so if your shell hits the plate at that angle, so like 10 degrees off the plate, so which would be like 80 on the scale, then it's going to bounce unless it overmatches. If it overmatches the plate, like if it's the side of the nose, for example, then it will go through because overmatch is the first calculation. So when the AP shell arrives, the very first calculation that happens is overmatch. If it doesn't, and if it overmatches, there is no ricochet calculation because it can't ricochet. If it doesn't overmatch, then it goes into the next calculation, which is does it bounce? Which is when it looks at, okay, which wedge are we in here? Are we in the doesn't bounce wedge, in which case you calculate penetration? Are we in the always bounce wedge, in which case it just bounces? Or are we in the maybe bounce wedge? And this might be where you're getting a little bit confused, because between 45 and 60, okay, so this 15-degree wedge here, it can penetrate. So what you're probably getting confused by, partially, is that the 45-degree angle isn't the cutoff. The cutoff for maybe getting an AP shell penetrating your hull is 60 from perpendicular to the plate. Now let me go back to the actual model, because, and this might be where you're getting a little bit confused as well. Actually, can we come out of emo so that, because otherwise Wheezy can't ask questions. Yeah, so the other thing you need to consider, and this might be where the mod is leading you a little bit astray, what that mod is showing you is the angle off of the keel, right? So it's, because it can't possibly give you the angle off of every single plate, because the plates are like curved and they curve in multiple different directions, because they curve around the side of the ship and they curve vertically as well. And that is taken into account. And so all the mod is doing is giving you the angle to the keel of the ship. And the problem is, as you can see here, this plate is not parallel with the keel, and it's also not vertical. So like, for example, if a shell lands here, if you have some of the ships that have those really kind of like rolled over wave breakers, it's possible that you could ricochet downwards. It's possible that a shell can come in at this angle, hit this overhang, and then ricochet this way, because it's not inside the will penetrate angle, right? So stop thinking of ships as rectangles. They're not rectangles. So for example, if I'm in a battleship that has a 45 to 60 standard bounce angle, and I'm trying to penetrate the side of a ship's nose, it's actually a pretty good target, because if I'm over here, this plate here might be at, say, 60. I'm going to try and guess 60. That's probably about 60. Which means that any shells that come out of my ship and hit this plate here are guaranteed to bounce if I'm in that 60 to 90 angle. Okay, so I cannot penetrate this under any circumstances unless I overmatch it, but there is no way that I'm in a ship that overmatches 356mm belt. I might overmatch the casemate, so that if I'm in a Yamato or something like that, then I might be able to penetrate this, but I'm not going to penetrate this. And I'd be much better off shooting this because it's much bigger and easier to hit. But let's say I'm not in a Yamato, let's say I'm in an Izumo, which doesn't overmatch itself. This plate here is much, much flatter to me than this plate here, right? And so you'll see very good battleship players and cruiser players and destroyer players in some situations. And when they're given this kind of target, they're not going to aim here, they're going to aim here. Because this plate, it has a flatter angle to me, and I'm definitely here inside the 45 to 60 angle, right? So if you draw a line perpendicular to this plate, and then you draw 45 degrees from that, and then 15 degrees from that, those are your three wedges. So I'm definitely inside the might bounce angle. I might even be inside the doesn't bounce angle, and then I can pen this. And on some ships, like Izumo, for example, that can result in a citadel, because if I take the nose armor off, what's behind that plate? Maybe citadel. Izumo has a very flat-flanted citadel, but Yamato has a hexagonal shape. That means that you have a citadel plate facing diagonally forwards, and that is called the cheek. You might have heard players refer to the cheek, and which is why in a Yamato you must never ever give this angle to a battleship or any of the big cruisers. The ship shape, yeah, the ship shape is very, very important because plates are not perpendicular generally. The side plates tend to be pretty flat to the keel. And so if you're shooting here, then that mod is going to be helpful. But if you're shooting the nose, then that mod is actually going to be misleading. And it's one of the reasons why I stopped using those kind of mods, because they can be quite misleading. You're better off just eyeballing it. Did that help? So when you're looking at a ship, another good example is, let me find something with a fairly rounded backside. That's too flat. Conqueror, no, British ships tend to have transoms. So that's still a bit pointy. GK? Nope, that's very pointy. Musashi, reckon? Ooh, Alabama might be good. Yeah, that's a bit fun. Search for the rounded ass. That's pretty good. Okay, it doesn't really matter. So so this is an important, you got a rounded ass, Timo. You've got a rounded, oh, you are a rounded ass. Maybe you're a well-rounded ass. Right. So, if you are in a really heavy cruiser, hey Zork. If you're in a very heavy cruiser that has the ability to penetrate battleship sort of armor, so this will have a 32 mil plate, which 8-inch AP at shorter ranges is not going to have a problem penetrating at all, because the penetration value for sort of 8+ inch AP is going to be in the hundreds of millimeters, not in the tens. So you can definitely pen this, but the challenge is getting the wedges right, okay? Zork, thank you very much for the raid. Welcome. I hope you had a good stream. We're just talking a little bit about AP penetration, because Wheezy asked a really good question about how do you avoid being citadeled in a battleship. So if I'm coming up behind this in, say, Stalingrad, something like that that's got a bit of punch, so I'm chasing this Alabama as it's running away on low health or whatever, what I've got to be really careful not to do is aim at the point of the stern if I'm not perpendicular to the point of the stern. So if I'm right behind it and I'm chasing it, then yes, you want to aim here, because that's the part of the plating that is 90 degrees to you. But if I'm 45 degrees off the stern, then you want to try and find the part of the plate, and this butt isn't really that rounded, but you want to try and look for the point of the armor that is 90 degrees to you and aim at that, because then most of your shells will fall within the doesn't bounce wedge, this 90-degree wedge, and you stand a very good chance of going through that plate. Whereas if you aim here, some of them might go through, but some of them will hit over here and then bounce off. So when you're aiming at a rounded plate like this, at close range, make sure that you are aiming at the part that is perpendicular to you, which is not going to be the back. Okay, that doesn't apply to transom sterns. So if you look at something like, in theory, Conqueror has one. So if you look at a British transom, for example, which is flat, then obviously this is a flat plate and you treat it like a flat plate. So you want to aim for the dead center, and you want to try to get within 45 degrees of perpendicular. Yeah, so just try and bear in mind the shape and angle of the plate that you're shooting at. And try to assume that whatever guns you're shooting have a 45 to 60 degree wedge range. But when you start playing a new ship, it's a good idea to check using something like Ship Tool. It's a good idea to check what the bounce angles are, because that information is not in the game. Lucy, are you off? It's nice to meet you. I hope you have a good rest of your weekend. Where would you... right, so head-to-head, that's very different. So one of the other things I wanted to say was going back to Izuma. Actually, Izuma's a really bad example. Let's just... let's stick with Conqueror. Or, yeah, so let's stick with Conqueror. So you're in a situation where you're using AP because something's giving you a really good broadside. The danger that a lot of battleship players fall into is that they try to get their back guns on target. A lot of battleship players lose their ship too early because they're being too greedy with their guns. Some players don't understand how AP works at all, and they'll just sit literally flat broadside to make sure they can get all their guns, and they'll just sit there and fire away until they die. And because it's a battleship and it lasts a reasonably long time, players who don't really care about learning the game just think that's fine and they're doing fine. Which is why I don't recommend that players play battleships as their first ships, because you can get away with broadsiding for a little while and it doesn't feel like you've made a huge mistake. Whereas if you do that with a cruiser, obviously you're going to regret that probably. So the problem is that Conqueror can fire 6 barrels forwards, but you're always there as the battleship player thinking, especially if you're on a 4-turret ship that's 2 and 2, you're always thinking, hang on a minute, I've got 4 turrets. I can get 12 barrels downrange. Let me just move that nose over a little bit. I know about angling, like I know I should be angling, but if I just push it a little bit more, I can get those back turrets on. And the problem is that on most battleships, not all, but most, that pushes your side plating into the can-pen angle against what you're shooting. So if you're trading shots with a battleship, especially in a ship like Conqueror, which has a very, very vulnerable citadel, because the citadel is literally here on the outside, that right there is citadel, you put yourself into a lot of danger. And so if you're going to be doing that playstyle, you need to be moving, because Conqueror is quite maneuverable, especially if you set it up for maneuverability. And so you need to be moving full speed so that you can kind of dip over, shoot your back guns, and dip back again in between their volleys. It's definitely a skill you need to learn in battleships, and it's also a skill that transfers quite well to a lot of cruisers, particularly kiting cruisers. But you can do the same thing in a battleship that's pointing forwards or backwards. But you can't do it if you're stationary. Okay. So if you need to be stationary for some reason or moving very slowly, don't, unless you know that the thing shooting back at you can't pen you, just use your front guns. Or if you're pointed away, just use your rear guns. That's probably another little mistake that you're making, is trying to be a little bit too greedy with your guns. But if you're gonna bow tank things or stern tank things, you need to understand your armor scheme. So Conqueror has a 32mm armor scheme. It's got this little bell here, but we'll ignore that. So it's got a 32mm nose and stern, which means that you can bow tank any battleship which is under, so not including, 460mm. So all of the 457s in the game and below can't pen your nose when you're like this. They can if you're like that. If you're facing something that's 460 or higher, Musashi, Yamato, Hanover, whatever, then they can go straight through this like butter. And so you need to try to not bow tank them. But bow tanking them is better than just broadsiding them, because obviously your nose silhouette is a lot smaller than your side profile. So if you have a choice, it's better to give the smallest silhouette possible. And maybe even angle over slightly so that some of their shells catch your belt and bounce. So in terms of nose to nose, if you're in a battleship shooting nose to nose, you have a few options. If you don't overmatch the nose, obviously if you overmatch their nose, just shoot the nose. You can aim with AP at the superstructure. So you can, until it gets saturated, you can get some pretty decent damage on the superstructure. You might pen the fronts of the turrets, but it's quite unlikely. So you probably want to aim a little bit higher than the turrets. If you can see the sides or the backs of the turrets, then you might be able to actually go through the sides. So if you're facing a battleship that's like that, but their guns are facing sideways, then you might want to actually try aiming at the sides of the turrets, because then maybe you can break the guns, either temporarily or maybe even permanently. Okay. Another perfectly viable option is, if they are nose in like this, and maybe you try a couple of AP volleys and don't get much, use HE. Don't be afraid against a nose-in target in a battleship of using HE. Because there are so many HE slinging ships in this game. There's also submarines that are setting floods. There's destroyers that are setting floods. There's planes that are doing fires and floods. So if you set a fire, that's probably going to be fairly serious for that ship, because probably someone else is going to get a fire and they're going to have to DCP, or maybe they just got torped by a submarine, or they've got pinged by a submarine and they've used their DCP. And so if you're nose to nose with another battleship, it's a really good idea to keep an eye on whether they've DCP'd. So you get those little flashy white lights on the ship when they DCP now. So look out for those DCP warning signals. Watch, like, if a fire like pops up and then immediately disappears, and you see the flashing lights, watch out for that. And then don't be afraid of switching to HE, because if you can set a permafire, and on a battleship you have a very high fire chance, so you're quite likely to set a fire, that's going to cause a lot of damage. Trying to break the guns is cool unless you're facing the front plate. So on most, go and have a look at a lot of battleship plating and you'll see what I mean. But generally, the roof and the side and the back of the turrets are not as well armored. So like the back is 178, right? So if this Conqueror is facing its nose at you but shooting over its shoulder, and you can see this plate, the 178 plate, then you can easily pen that. Subs are fun for Russian battleships? Not. Does that help, Pigeon? I hope that's a lot of information, so feel free to go back in the VOD and listen to that again. And maybe watch that highlight as well, because that's me basically explaining the same thing, but in a different order. Hopefully that's helped. Cool. I'm glad. Yeah, no, I get it. Like, I understand. Like, if you don't understand exactly how the mechanics work in reality, I can understand how you could be a bit confused as to why you've just been citadeled when you thought you were angling. Sometimes it's just you get the angle wrong. Sometimes it's just, I think that's enough angle, and then it turns out it's not. Especially with that might bounce wedge, because don't forget, if the shells arrive inside that, in this case, 15-degree might bounce wedge, all the shells could bounce, or all the shells could pen, or anywhere in between. So it can be a little bit frustrating, confusing. Because, if you're close to that 60 degrees, that can be kind of confusing. One other thing to talk about is the difference between the guns. So if you're doing a drive-by, let's say I'm in my Conqueror and I'm driving by another battleship, don't forget, so imagine that I'm shooting, imagine this wharf is the other battleship, right? So I'm driving alongside, and I'm coming up to being alongside. My front guns, if I've got all my guns prepared and pointing sideways to do the drive-by, the angle from here to here is 90 degrees. The angle from here to here is not 90 degrees. That is more like 45 degrees. So you need to be really careful when you're doing a drive-by that you don't accidentally shoot too soon with your rear guns if you're going forwards. Because the closer you get to a ship, the bigger the difference in the angle between your guns. At long ranges, it makes no difference at all, really. Although it will do, very slightly. If a ship is very close to one of those like wedges, if the plate that the shell hits is maybe they're turning away, like the difference in the angle between your turrets could make a difference at long range, but it's not as much of a difference. At very close ranges, it's a huge difference. And so these barrels might have 90 degrees and pen no problem. These ones might bounce if you shoot them at the same time. So you need to make sure that you're not double clicking. You need to make sure when you're doing a drive-by that you like click your front ones, and then as your rear ones come along line, then you click again. And you need to learn how to switch your camera between the turrets so that you get the best view. So using the C key to switch between the two turrets, or two sets of turrets, because then you'll have a better judgment of when you're alongside. That's it. Lesson over.